Wang Changling at the Hibiscus Tower, farewell to Xinjiang. Cold rain crossed the river, the night we entered Wu. Now in the dawn I send you on alone through the mountains of Chu. When you get back to Luoyang, if my friends should ask about me, tell them my heart is still pure, an ice crystal in a jade vase. So we move on to the 3 poems by Wang Changling, which are included in this section of the anthology. Wang Changling is a pretty well represented poet, I think, in this book. We've encountered him before, at least, and more than a couple of times. Now, Wang Changling is a Hai Tang poet, not very successful. I think we already talked about his career in a previous video. He was quite smart. He actually passed 2 different examinations, the Jinshi and afterwards a special examination for great talents, but because of reasons that are not altogether clear, but which are probably related to his having a very unconventional behavior, he was actually pretty unfortunate and got demotions pretty commonly. I think the consensus based on a master's thesis which I found today, which I'll link in the description, which is exclusively about his heptasyllabic quatrains. In that thesis, it's mentioned that he was probably exiled at least 3 times to 3 different places. One in the remote south, one in the center south, one in the eastern coast. And the 3rd exile is the one that interests us today because it's related to this poem. So, at the Hibiscus Tower, farewell to Xinjiang, you can pretty straightforwardly see from the title that it is going to be a parting poem. And we've encountered many of these poems before. 2 friends, scholar officials, have to say goodbye. They've met by chance or for any other reason, but one of them is going to some other place. These poems are always set in a tone of, played to a tone of sadness and melancholy, because, this parting is felt probably genuinely because, scholar officials had some relatively close relations with each other, although not all the poems of parting probably really represent a close friendship between the writers. Part of this poetry is, socially conventional poetry between scholar officials. But this poetry, really rings a note for scholar officials who have to go to different parts of the country, sometimes in exile, sometimes in service, be parted from the group of scholar official friends with whom maybe they've passed the examinations and whom they appreciate on a personal and on an intellectual note. And, the empire was very vast. It was a very real possibility that any parting could be a permanent parting for life, because one of the people who was parting from each other might die during the interval. So, parting poem with all the melancholy attendant on a parting poem. Also, at least based on the interpretation that I've read in the master's thesis, and I think it's even clear in this translation of the poem by Geoffrey Waters, there's also at least as strong as the parting element, an element of self-vindication, which connects with the fact that, as we said, Wang Changling was in exile here. So the last line, which has a very powerful image, a very aesthetically pleasing image, also connects with self-representations of the poet as a virtuous official that has been exiled through no fault of his own. So let's go on with the poem. As we said, this is a heptasyllabic quatrain. Wang Changling had a great reputation for these. In fact, he is represented by 3 poems in this section. He's not the best represented poet in this section, is he? Well, maybe he is. I haven't checked. But no, I think Dumu has more. Yeah, I think Dumu and Li Shangjing have many more. But it was the convention in Chinese literature is that Wang Changling excelled at heptasyllabic quatrains. In fact, he fixed the model of the heptasyllabic quatrain for different periods to come, and he probably is a very good representative of what some literary critics call the Tang synthesis. So one thing that appears quite evident to many readers who stumble upon Chinese classical poetry is the way in which the landscape, the nature, the objective world of objects is generally used as a coded reference to the subjective feelings of the poet in poetry. That is to say, you sometimes get poems, lots of them, where you don't have the feelings of the poet directly stated. You just have what seems to be a landscape poem describing nature, but precisely that description of nature is conveying the feelings of the poem and of the poet. And this synthesis of a more subjective poetry that expresses feelings directly, and that, for example, was typical in China in the period of disunion at the beginning, in the Jianan era, and a more landscape-oriented poetry that is descriptive and rich, like was popular in the last centuries of the period of disunion. The synthesis of these two genres, even though in some ways it's already present in the Chinese poetic tradition since its origin, but the masterful synthesis of this is attained in the poetry of the Tang Dynasty. And it goes even further. So the great Tang poets, beyond the synthesis, are also able to create reverberations, that is, to include a certain degree of ambiguity and evocativeness that brings in the reader as a necessary co-constructor of meaning for the poem. And, well, all this big detour about classical Chinese poetry as a synthesis of the objective and the subjective, of a landscape which is imbued with subjective feelings which are not stated explicitly. All of this is mentioned because Wang Changling is generally considered one of the masters of achieving this in poetry, and his quatrains generally represent this very well. And Wang Changling was also a literary critic. There is a compendium of texts on the writing of poetry, which has survived in Japan, not in China, and which is believed to have been written by him. It was taken to Japan by the monk Kukai, and it's generally referred to by its Japanese name, Bunkyo Hifuron. It's an encyclopedia of literature that explains how to create these effects. Anyway, let's move to this specific poem. So, first of all, the title, At the Hibiscus Tower, Farewell to Xinjiang. We don't know who Xinjiang is, so probably a scholar official. The building that is being mentioned, the Hibiscus Tower, or others have translated it as the Hibiscus Inn, Furong Lo, would have been located in the Danyang district of present-day Jiangsu province, so eastern part of China, close to the sea. Now, this location of this poem probably indicates when the poem was written, because this Hibiscus Tower is pretty close to Jiangling. And Jiangling was one of the three places, I think the second one, to which Wang Changling was demoted, so exiled in a way. It's a short distance from Jiangling to the Hibiscus Tower. And a curious thing, Jiangling, we've already encountered Jiangling obliquely in the past. Jiangling is modern-day Nanjing, the great city of southern China, which was a capital of China during the period of disunion under a different name, Chenkang. It was razed to the ground by the conquering unifiers of the Shui dynasty, but it was rebuilt in the Tang, and with this name, with Jiangling. So probably this poem is composed when Wang Changling is in exile and pretty close to this tower. The location of this tower is also close to the Grand Canal, so the person who is parting Xinjiang would have been returning probably to the capital from what is described in the poem, and he would have been able to do all of the long trip by boat, like going up the Grand Canal until joining the Yellow River and then on to Luoyang, which was the eastern capital of the Tang Dynasty. They had two capitals. Okay, so first couplet. Cold rain crossed the river the night we entered Wu. Now, in the dawn, I send you on, alone, through the mountains of Chu. So the first couplet is the one that really strikes the parting poem subject matter that we typically encounter in these poems. So the first couplet basically explains everything. It says, we came together through here, into this region, but now we're parting. You're going out, I'm staying here alone. So parting time has come. So it says, cold rain crossed the river the night we entered Wu. So Wu, there are two references to geographical places. Wu was the name of the old kingdom in the eastern coast of China, where the Yangtze River meets the sea. And to its east, and basically on the middle course of the Yangtze, was the old kingdom of Chu. So these references are from the point of view of this position at the Hibiscus Tower. If you look east to where Wang Changling is residing, that's the area of the old state of Wu. If you look to the north and to the west, where the Grand Canal is going to take Xinjiang back to the eastern capital, that's the area of the old kingdom of Chu. And of course, poets generally like using these poetic ancient names for referring to what would have been in that day, modern provinces. So this poem is very geographical. This couplet is very geographical. Like it says, we came into Wu, now you're going back to Chu. And the first couplet is the one that is imbued with nature images. And remember, nature resonates. So the fact that cold rain crossed the river the night we entered Wu already starts tinging the poem with this element of sadness and sorrow. The rain is like tears, and it's a cold rain, not a warm rain. So an unpleasant rain hitting the river when we entered, probably preluding this painful separation that we are about to experience. And now in the dawn I send you on alone through the mountains of Chu. So the other poet is meant to cross, or poet, the friend of the poetic persona, is going back and is going through the mountains of Chu. So mountains generally appear in poetry as indicative of the difficulty, of the roughness of the terrain that the traveler is going to have to traverse with. So they already connote also an element of sadness, of melancholy. Okay, second couplet. So the first one was more like describing, more narrative, like describing the situation. The second one is more like conveying a message. So this is the situation, we're parting now, and I'm going to give you a message for our common friends that you're going to see at Luoyang. As I said, Luoyang was the eastern capital, and it was destined to become, an even more prosperous city in the future, or at least its area, because it's in the middle lower course of the Yellow River, while Chang'an, which was the main capital of the Tang Dynasty in this period, was located in much further to the west and in a land that was being severely ecologically depleted by having a more than a million inhabitants city in a relatively barren or overexploited terrain. In fact, Chang'an would never be again after the Tang an important capital for the later Chinese dynasties. Anyway, the message in the second couplet. When you go back to Luoyang, if my friends should ask about me, tell them my heart is still pure, an ice crystal in a jade vase. So the message he conveys to his friends is, tell them I am pure, that is, I am not corrupted, maybe by the climate, or I'm still the honest guy who lived along them in the capital. And, this pure image is emphasized by this beautiful image of a jade vase, so shiny, bright, transparent, with ice inside it. Yeah, an ice crystal in a jade vase. It looks a bit too much of a juxtaposition. Why is there an ice crystal and then jade outside? So like two layers. But whatever, it still, transmits an image of this transparency, shininess, brightness that is meant to represent the moral virtue of the poet. So there is a slight criticism on his exile. There's Wang Changling is clearly saying, I'm an honest and incorrupt and pure official. I shouldn't be here in exile, and I'm still the same incorrupt, honest, and virtuous official that you, my friends, knew when I was at the capital. In fact, these images, these metaphors of shiny, lustrous jewels or materials associated with or symbolizing the moral virtue of the scholar official, these are very common. They already appear in the book of Songs, in the Shijing, in one of the verses which says that, jade can be polished, and which has generally been interpreted from its context and also from allegorical interpretation as a symbol of the possibility of moral improvement by a person. But there's another case that another translation of this poem mentions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, the poem ends in this beautiful, slightly enigmatic image. If the first couplet was, as I said, mainly about landscape. The second couplet is about a message, but it's also encapsulated in a beautiful, pure, shiny object, which is meant to stand in for the poet himself. So this is quite a nice poem, and it actually, I think justifies Wang Changling's reputation. But as I said, while I was looking for some background to talk about this poem, I encountered a master's dissertation. It was, I'll try to link it in the description. This is a doctoral dissertation, master's dissertation, sorry, called The Study of Wang Changling's 7-character quatrain by Jing Huijiang, presented at the National Tsinghua University in 1984. So it's a short thesis. It's less than 100 pages. And it comments on all the quatrains, so I imagine it will be a source on all the heptasyllabic quatrains of Wang Changling. So I imagine it will be pretty useful for the other 2 poems that we have to comment in this series. And it presents quite, I would say, quite a different translation. Yeah, quite different. So let me find it for you. Here it is, and let me read it. So, for example, the dissertation explains that this poem, which is highly acclaimed, is the first of 2. And he translates it thus. Cold rain along the Jiangzi enters Wu by night. At dawn, farewell to my guest. The Chu mountain stands alone. Tell Luoyang friends and relatives who ask you how I am. The crystal-like interior inside a jade vase. So you can see the translation, well, it generally matches the ideas, but there's quite a lot of differences. So, for example, in the way in which it's translated in the dissertation, the first couplet does not really talk about when the 2 people entered in some undisclosed past the area and now they're parting. It actually represents, or seems to be representing, the last night that these 2 people spend together. So in this night, not when we first came to this area, in this night, the cold rain is entering this area of Wu. This probably, this could also be an example of using the cold rain as a metaphor for tears, for coldness, for sadness, and evoking probably a night together of the 2 characters in this poem, a sleepless night spent before the parting. And at dawn, farewell to my guest. At dawn, we say goodbye. The Chu mountain stands alone. So you can see that in this version, the alone is not the poet. The alone is the mountain, the Chu mountain. So remember, in Chinese poems, there are no indications generally of pronouns, of subjects, of tenses, of singular and plural. So what was translated in the other poem as the Chu mountains is here translated as one, the Chu mountain. So in the direction in which Wang Changling's friend is going, there's probably one of the mountains of Chu, just one standing alone. So here the mountain very clearly can act as the lonely mountain as a symbol for both of the people who are parting, but especially for Wang Changling. He, like the Chu mountain, also stands alone in Jiangling. Anyway, those are not so big differences, but I think this translation puts a greater emphasis on how the imagery of the external world in the first couplet really correlates with the feelings of sadness at parting and at a brief night, and subtly creating a sense of intimacy between the 2 friends. So the transformation of external imagery to reflect the narrator's inner feelings is the typical thing that we mentioned earlier that is associated with Haitang poetry. Now the second poem moves from nature, but not from imagery, and it mentions this object. In this translation, it's clear that it's not a 2-layered object. It's just a jade vase that is very polished, so that its interior looks like glass, looks like crystal. And it's probably semi-transparent, allowing to see what is inside, which, further connects with those metaphors of transparency and of moral purity of the scholar official that we mentioned earlier. So now, this image is a very interesting one, and where does this image of the enigmatic jade vase with a crystal-like interior comes? Well, the author of the dissertation tells us that this is probably an allusion to a contemporary poem by Yao Chong, who lived from 650 to 721. It's a fu, so not the type of poems we encounter here. That is, fu have been translated generally as prose poems, rhyme proses, yeah, that sort of thing. And that would be the prose poem on a crystal vase, the Bing Hu Fu. And in the preface to that poem, the poet uses the crystal vase as a symbol for a bureaucrat who performs official duties in an honest manner. And it says like this: the crystal vase is the epitome of purity and cleanliness. When a gentleman faces it, he will never forget its purity. The vase is thoroughly transparent without blemish, so clear and empty that one can see its bottom. Among the officials who are clear and plain, are there any comparable to this? Hence, to embrace a crystal-clear purity inside and possess a jade-like smoothness outside is the crystalline virtue of a gentleman. So, this clearly hammers in the idea, as we've said, that the poet is selling himself as a very virtuous and honest person who is not guilty for his current situation of exile, for his predicament in the southeast, or rather east, of the country. Despite the accusations, my innocence and purity of character are still as fresh as and unsullied as ice and jade. So, a beautiful and quite a convincing image. Packs quite a punch.